Today we are continuing on with our analysis of the First Amendment by the Court of Appeals in the TikTok decision, and we are going to start really delving into specific facts presented in the case. This is the juicy stuff. We're going to kick this off by looking at the first criteria of strict scrutiny, which is that the government's interests are compelling. Let's go. The Department of Justice, on behalf of the United States, offered two national security justifications for the act, the one that banned TikTok. And those two are, number one, to counter efforts by China to collect data of and about Americans, and two, the risk of China using content manipulation via TikTok. Ultimately, the Court of Appeals found that each of these justifications constituted, and I quote, an independently compelling national security interest. Among the chief persuasion was information and testimony provided by the Assistant Director of National Intelligence, who explained, and I quote, that China is the most active and persistent cyber espionage threat to the United States, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. Its hacking program, quote, spans the globe, end quote, and is larger than that of every other major nation combined. Goes on to say that China has pre-positioned itself for potential cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure by building out offensive weapons within that infrastructure. The court was quite persuaded by the DOJ's presentation of extensive and multi-year efforts by China to accumulate data sets on Americans. This was done through hacking operations and, very importantly, by utilizing its relationships with Chinese companies. The court also found that China poses a particular threat because it has enacted laws that ensure it has access and use of data collected by Chinese companies. It particularly cites China's National Security Law of 2015, which requires all Chinese citizens and corporations to provide necessary support to national security authorities. The court also looked at China's Cybersecurity Law of 2017, which requires Chinese corporations, among other things, to grant the government full access to its data. These justifications, among others, led the court to believe that companies based in China do not and cannot operate independently from the government the way private companies do in the United States. As a result of this, China can, and I quote, conduct espionage, technology transfer, data collection, and other disruptive activities under the disguise of an otherwise legitimate commercial activity. Specifically relating to TikTok, the court was satisfied by the DOJ's arguments that the company would, pursuant to these laws, comply with requests by China for its data, and honing in on ByteDance, which, remember, is TikTok's ultimate parent company and co-petitioner on this case, that its chief editor and at least 138 of its employees based out of the Beijing office are standing members of a Chinese Communist Party committee. As regards data collection, TikTok never denies that it collects a significant amount of data on its users. However, the court ultimately finds that TikTok's own arguments regarding its data practices actually support concerns raised by the DOJ. For example, TikTok argues that its platform is far too large and integrated to ever divest, and that in the previous attempts to negotiate a national security agreement, ByteDance would have always maintained at least some level of access to U.S. users' data. Another key argument by TikTok that the court squarely rejects is that the act's data collection concerns are speculative. The court states, rather firmly, that the U.S. need not wait for the risk to materialize and instead may rely upon informed judgment. Among other evidence of this informed judgment, the court looks to former TikTok employees who asserted that the app shares U.S. user data on Chinese government-based internal communication systems. These employees also asserted that the division of ByteDance responsible for the U.S.-based platform has approved sending U.S. data to China several times. In summary, the court was well persuaded that the national security concerns raised by the DOJ are well-founded and not speculative. In terms of content manipulation, the court finds that China's ability to manipulate public discourse on the TikTok app is actually at odds with the principles of free speech. It cites a Supreme Court case from earlier this year, NetChoice, in stating, which I quote, "The First Amendment precludes a domestic government from exercising comparable control over a social media company in the United States." The court then goes even further by saying that Congress, through this act and its prohibitions, is actually vindicating the fundamental principles of the First Amendment. Well, there you have it. The main reasons behind the court's decisions that the government's interests are compelling. In the third and final video on the First Amendment analysis, we will get into the act being narrowly tailored, set within the facts of the case. Stay tuned.